Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the BimTube podcast. With me today, I've got Gary Nuttall. So thank you for joining me and welcome, Gary.
Hey, Stephen. Thanks for inviting me.
Thank you. And we were just chatting before we started recording about what I mean by BIM. So in this context, I do mean better information management, and I'm aware it can mean many things, and maybe we'll talk about that. But thank you, Gary, again for joining me. We've had a little bit of a think about the kind of topics we'll cover, but just to begin with, what I ask all the guests, if you could just introduce yourself, if you don't mind. Of course, I know you, but also your background. So I think it's really important to understand how people got into the role that they're in. So people start from a different place. So over to you, Gary, just a quick introduction and your background, please.
Sure thing. So I promote myself as an emerging technology consultant these days. And I've been doing that for about 7 years. And it took me about 5 years to realize that's what I actually do. So it's straight away, it's one of those things about how do you label what you do and that kind of thing. So I help organizations better understand emerging technologies, what the risks and issues are. And so I get involved in really interesting projects around things like blockchain, artificial intelligence, data analytics, crypto related things, all sorts of kiddie in the sweet shop type stuff really. But I've been hands-on with some of this stuff. So I help companies now actually better understand the reality from the myth. And it's kind of interesting. We'll go into my background a little bit more later on. But the company I set up is called Distalytics. And originally that was meant to be because my background is analytics, distributed ledger, which is blockchain type stuff. So distributed ledger analytics, Distalytics, it sounded like a good idea after a glass of wine. And when I realized that there was no website registered as that, what I've actually come to realize is that what I actually do is I distill things through analytics. So I'm kind of repositioning what Distalytics means. So I help companies understand the reality of some of these technologies.
Great. Thanks, Gary. And there's so many things we could pick up on because you mentioned blockchain and distributed ledger. And of course, there'll be lots of people listening or watching this that have no idea what them things are. So we'll get onto them. But just briefly, if you could also just give your background, just briefly your career progression. We can always go back to some elements if you don't mind. Sure. That'd be great. Thanks.
Sure. So I started in retail in the mid 1980s as a computer operator, which was a job that doesn't exist anymore. Literally changing computer tapes on computers and that kind of thing. That was in the retail industry where I got my first exposure to data analytics and did big data before it was called big data. Moved on to pharmaceuticals, commodity trading, insurance, the wine industry, probably a few other industries I forgot to mention as well, over about 30 to 35 years. And then, as I say, about 7 years ago, became an independent.
Great, thank you. That's the most concise and thrifty summary of someone's career I've ever had. So I like it. So it goes with the theme of distilling. I like it. You're a man of your word. So thank you. Clearly there's loads of things we can touch on, but let's cut to the chase for people that think, oh, what is that? So maybe blockchain, but could you just give an overview, if you don't mind, of what a distributed ledger is or are, and then the typical common uses? So I assume people know the most obvious ones, but maybe some of the alternative uses would be great, and then we can maybe draw on a few of them.
Sure. So we start off with really basics. What is a ledger? A ledger is a record of transactions in some way. Quite often it's a financial ledger. So, I sent Steve £50 on Friday type thing, and you write that down, and that's a ledger of the transaction. Now, typically ledgers are computerized these days. Now, we don't write them down in paper ledgers anymore, but we'll keep that concept in mind for a minute, and we'll park that and explain how a distributed ledger works a bit more. So we've got this transaction. I've sent Steve £50 on Friday. You've sent Colin £25 on Thursday, blah, blah, blah. So each business, each individual has their own ledger of transactions. The problem with that is that each of us maintains our own ledger, and each of us then has to reconcile that we've not lost any data between them and everything. So that's actually quite inefficient. So what we can do is, through the magics of technology and databases, is that we can operate off a single ledger. So imagine it as like a big spreadsheet in the sky on a cloud, for example, which is just a single ledger of everybody's transactions everywhere. Now, with that being a single ledger, what it means is that we all have to agree on what the contents are, which gets rid of all the reconciliation and overhead straight away, but we're no longer having to compare things. And we've got that single source of the truth. And it's fascinating. In my career in analytics, we always used to talk about a single version of the truth. Well, I've actually realized it's better to have a single source of the truth. At least we all know where to go to make sure the data is consistent. So we've now got the single ledger. And what we want to do is give a copy of it out to everybody, so we distribute it. So there we go, we've got a distributed ledger. It's just that everyone's got an identical copy of the information. That's it, probably as a starting point on that.
Great, thank you. I've certainly, I mean, of course, we've talked about it and you've kindly presented as well when through a group that we were involved with at the British Computer Society about blockchain, and I remember there's lots of people turning up. It's of the moment. I mean, for you, you've probably been doing it for longer than most, obviously, so it won't be of the moment for you. But my point being, most people will have heard of it now. I think that's when things have broken through. Most people have heard of blockchain, even if they don't know what a distributed ledger. Just one thing that always comes to mind is security, and I know that was something we're probably going to touch on as well, but in my day job to do with information governance, information management, security, how do you keep the information secure on a distributed ledger if by definition it's public? How does that work?
So there's two main ways. The first of which is, like any other system, it can either be a public or a private ledger. A public ledger, a bit like Bitcoin, we've probably all heard of Bitcoin, that's got a public ledger behind it, which means everyone can access it. There's no restrictions on it at all. What we also have is what's called a private ledger. This is like a members club. So you think of the banks, for example, Barclays, HSBC, they could make their ledger private so that only participants can view it straight away. So that's a starting point. So it may or may not be open to public use, depending on how you want to use it. Then we take it a level further and we introduce a piece of mathematics called cryptography. And cryptography, I describe it as the mathematics of keeping secrets. So we go back to what I described before of a distributed ledger, of everyone having a copy of that ledger. One of the problems with that straight away is you don't really want it that everyone can see everyone's transactions. So what we can do, we can put cryptography on the top of it, which is a way of making information secret so that only I can see information that's related to information to me. You can only see information related to you, or Barclays can only see theirs, and so on. So cryptography, fantastic. I get involved with a number of companies doing it, keeping secrets mathematically.
Yeah, the reason I mentioned that, it often comes up with the other BIM, which I'll just put it out there, building information modeling, and what I mean there is more the international standards, ISO 19650 for the benefit of people listening or watching, and things like digital twins. Have you got any examples of where distributed ledger technology is being used either in digital twins or sort of metaverse, that kind of area?
So you left ahead straight away by mentioning metaverse, because that's a great example of how digital twins are being applied in that way. So go back to this digital ledger for a minute. Let's put some security onto it, which is what the blockchain layer is. That's the security protocol that ensures that it's all distributed and it's all secure. And then start thinking about, as you say, building information management. We've got all this information which extends into this realm of a digital twin, where you've got a digital representation of a physical object. Now it's secured by cryptography, sits on a ledger. So now we've got the same benefits that I was describing before, the fact that everyone's got common access to what they are allowed to access. So the idea of a digital twin on a blockchain is, again, it uses the same kind of methodology. Think of it, instead of it sitting on a simple database, it's sitting on a distributed database called a blockchain. So we kind of flip the words, but it's commonality. Extend that further and think about how this digital twin, you can now see it. You know, you can see a 3D representation of a building model in that within potentially a virtual reality environment. And now you've got the metaverse, where many people might be familiar with games like Roblox or Call of Duty or whatever, which are kind of metaverse-like in that they are second or third worlds. But imagine it that on Roblox, for example, anyone who's got children will know that their kids play Roblox, they play various games, but you can produce things, you can build things, you can build buildings, with building blocks and so on. But you need the ability to then transfer that to different environments. At the moment, if you do something in Roblox, it's within the Roblox ecosystem. If you do something within a different platform, it's not transferable. If it all sits on a distributed ledger as the common infrastructure sitting underneath it makes it that much easier to transfer these digital artifacts. And this is where things like digital twins of buildings, for example, is coming into play. So I'm seeing more and more examples of companies who are using traditional BIM in the original context of building information management to support the physical design and management of buildings, but then taking that digital twin and putting it into the metaverse and then putting a VR layer on top of it, which means you can do things like if you're doing a new store, for example, you can do aisle layouts and presentations and work out where the staff are going to work and what the people flows are and everything. So it's all very exciting. Lots and lots of companies doing research into this, as is always the case. Hype and myth beats practical reality. So there aren't that many real examples of what's going on yet. And I tend to be more looking at the potential as opposed to the actual stuff at the moment.
Where is it? I mean, this is partly rhetorical, but if you want to answer, it's fine. Where do you think digital twins are on the Gartner hype cycle?
Yeah. So for those unfamiliar with the Gartner hype cycle, we start off with the initial explosion of enthusiasm, which they call the peak of inflated expectations. This is where marketing, PR announcements completely outweigh the reality of what's going on. Then you get a leveling out, which is kind of like a kind of a plateau stage. But just before you get to that plateau, you get what they call the trough of disillusionment. And this is where reality hits, and actually the technology never measures up to the marketing hype. And then over time it levels out and it improves in there. So with digital twins, I think we are seeing that is kind of stabilizing, that is leveling out. Companies are beginning to use that. Where that aligns with the metaverse and blockchain distributed ledgers, I think we're about to fall off that cliff of the hype cycle, and we're about to go into the trough of disillusionment phase. But out of it, things will stabilize, reality will kick in, and the technology will catch up with what marketers have been claiming.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting because we both have, I mean, obviously by definition, technology backgrounds and data management backgrounds. I think it is a lot of these things are challenging to communicate the potential benefits to people that don't have that background. Do you know what I mean? So it might be immediately obvious some of the benefits in a distributed ledger. I know you've explained them, but to people with that background, but it's quite hard to keep having a different story or selling the benefits when it does hit the trough of disillusionment. It's like I mean, I know you said there weren't many examples necessarily of digital twin at this stage, but have you got any tangible examples of where blockchain is implemented, or you've been involved? What I'm thinking are things that are maybe not in the financial. I don't want to literally put words in your mouth, but I will. Things like land ownership, land transfer, things like that. Have you been involved with that? I'm interested in that one.
I'm certainly aware of some projects that I've tried and have not succeeded. So I do a lot of presenting at conferences and events and there, where I describe myself as a pragmatic evangelist, in that I talk about how this stuff's actually being used, not about how it could be used. So in the insurance sector, that's my kind of niche. If we do a Venn diagram of blockchain technology and insurance, where they overlap, it says Gary Nuttall in the middle there, very much my strength. So I do have examples in the insurance sector where they're already doing policy administration, claims handling, and so on, using blockchain. So there are real world things there. Looking in terms of land registry, there was a great example in Central America which I'm not going to give the country, because it actually went live and then it got pulled back because it hits the reality of politics in that region. So they were trying to do a land registry, which wasn't successful simply because of politics. One that has been successful is in Estonia. And Estonia has introduced its whole e-governance program, where it's put a digital asset register in place on a blockchain, whereby they've registered all their property, all of their land, but also all of their people and their health records and everything else. And the reason being, you know, some of the benefits of blockchain technology is it's immutable, which means it's almost impossible to change. So it's like etched in stone; it can't be changed. It's distributed, which means it's resilient against being attacked by hackers or governments or whatever. And it's consistent as well. So the Estonian government implemented that a few years ago, and I describe it jokingly as being because they're aware that sometimes the neighbours might come to pay a visit for the barbecue at the weekend and don't go away for a few years, which unfortunately is exactly what we're seeing elsewhere on the borders of Russia at the moment. So Estonia actually implemented a digital land registry, and it was interesting that a few years ago I was giving a conference speech about this, and there was a lady who was from Estonia and actually said about how successful it was, and then someone else put their hand up and they said, oh yes, my country has done the same. It's like, oh, which country are you? And they were from Georgia, which is another former Soviet satellite state. So it seems there's a commonality of themes there in terms of land registry. The idea being that if your country is temporarily visited for a number of years, you want an ability that when the invaders leave, that you still know who owns what and everything, and blockchain kind of makes it natural for that. There are less controversial examples of land registry. If you think about it, in the UK, land registry was very much paper-based. It's now going digital. There are some projects and initiatives of trying to replicate that around the world using blockchain. It is quite slow. I keep describing, we hear about the people, process, and technology triangle, which isn't really a triangle, it's a hierarchy. And the most important thing is the people, because they're the ones who block it. The processes happen, technologies incidental. But the thing that makes all that flow is data. And this is where a lot of the time the problem is actually around getting the data. Because my understanding with the UK land registry is I think something like at least 40% of land in the UK isn't on the land registry, because it only goes on the registry at the point at which it gets registered for title change. So if it's been in the same ownership for 200 years, there won't be a land registry entry. Taking this forwards, there are examples now, and this is where it starts coming into the metaverse, of companies trying to do real estate via blockchain. So the idea that you'll have fractional ownership of property is really interesting, because different countries have different laws about how many people can own a property or how many can own land. I think in the UK it's about 16 or 20. And so they're introducing concepts of having land registration on a blockchain of more than 16 to 20 people on a secondary market. So it means that you can resell parts of it now. That finally links in with the metaverse, where there are metaverse entities that represent the physical representation. So you buy a plot of land in a metaverse that actually represents a shopping mall in Dubai. So there are projects on that. So quite a long-winded scenic journey of where this space is going.
I think that was great, Gary. I was yeah, well, through some of the work I've been doing, we've been looking at Estonia as well. So that certainly does come up in a very positive way about their maturity with interoperability. And so, yeah, just to echo that, absolutely. And you did touch on it. One thing I was going to ask, actually, value, that one of the last sort of sentence you were saying there was about the value digital representation of an asset and therefore the value. The question I was trying to formulate earlier was like, how do you attribute value to the actual data? Now, I know you weren't actually talking about that. You were talking about a representation of value, which is manifested physically. But in my mind, I'm not too sure if I'll be able to structure the question now, but how do we value the data itself is what I'm thinking. the actual data, the actual information. Do you think there is value in the actual data itself, irrespective of what it links to in the physical world? What do you think about that?
Yeah. So I sometimes use the analogy, and you've probably heard it many times, about how data is the new oil. And I actually, for my analogy, I actually explain how it is that there are similarities in as much as sometimes you don't know where you're going to get it from. You have to refine it, you have to clean it, you have to do things to it to make it fit for purpose. There are different types of oil for different purposes, and the same data. And ultimately, the fundamental function of oil is that you either burn it to generate energy, or you use it to oil the wheels of your business in some way. And it's the same with data. You either have to consume it in some way. So this is where the likes of the social media platforms burn your data in order to figure out, what your buying habits are and what your likes are and all this kind of thing. Or you use the data to actually oil the machinery of your organization. And that's one of those things that it's a bit like when you stop putting oil in an engine. You can't really easily value the value of the oil until the engine seizes up. And it's the same with data, that it's not easy to put a value on it, but try stop using it and try and make decisions without it. So it's almost as though data kind of has I think you describe it as a hygiene cost. It's not the presence of it that delivers value, it's the absence of it that delivers cost. So the way I've described it in the past, sometimes my role, I was an advisor to one company, and someone said, what's your job as an advisor? I said, it's to keep the CEO out of jail. And this is actually how data comes into it at times, that sometimes we use data, we keep talking about making better informed decisions. And sometimes it's the decision of not what to do, but what not to do. And that's kind of hard to put price on it. But keeping the CEO out of jail is a good one. But certainly in financial services, things like fines, levies, prosecutions, again, it's an unusual one with data, but it can be very useful for that.
Yeah, I guess it'd be, based on what you just said, hard to give specific examples based on the sensitivity around it. But I mean, I'm just thinking about the decision-making side of it. That's a lot of the sort of things I do for the day job, is like you with the analytics or the data side of it. I mean, how do you think things have improved, say, in the last decade? So, for example, the fact that we can have an open conversation about analytics and business intelligence and talk about it relatively openly, assuming people know what we mean, is have you seen an improvement in that conversation? Say, what dashboards do you want, or is that still an effort to get people there?
Well, actually, I find that what we found is that the general population have become more familiar with the idea of data-driven decision making, because we all do it. Even if it's that we just go onto Amazon, and when we're doing a comparison between two products, we look at what's got 5 stars instead of what's got 4 stars. So we do that in some way. But businesses are waking up to the fact that true data-driven decision making really helps them. I've got an example, or many examples from my career, where I implemented a new business intelligence solution, and this mashed a load of data together of what we were selling, what revenue we were generating, all that. And it's fascinating because the day it went live, and this was over 10 years ago now, the day it went live, within 15 minutes, I had a phone call from the marketing director's secretary. And this kind of goes back to the old world for a moment. She said, oh, the director's just been on, he's looked at your system, switch it off because it's wrong and come down to his office now. So quite scary, new system just gone live and everything. And I go down to the director's office, and he's surrounded by the typists and secretaries, so very, very much old world still. And I got through this armory of people, and I got summoned into his office, and he actually had a computer, which was a start for him. And he said, oh, your system's wrong. Like, what do you mean my system's wrong? He said, well, I've just been looking at the numbers that your newfangled system's just come up with, and if they were right, we'd be going bust in 6 months. So switch it off and sort it out. And he was actually absolutely right, that we were going to go bust in 6 months because the data was correct. And what they'd never realized up till this point is that there were certain business transactions we were doing that we were increasing the number of them without realizing they were losing us money. And so this was one of the great things that I actually was able to use the system to show to him. What we were doing is that we were giving customers rebates for more than they were paying for the goods, effectively handing money over. So he was right that we were going to go bust. That was a great project because it actually meant within 15 minutes, he went back to the supplier who was involved in this. We worked out that they were committing a thing called fraud in what they were doing. And we'd have never known about it if it wasn't for this thing. So straight away, I had my greatest advocates on the board about using analytics, and a payback period on a project of about 30 minutes in total. I think I'm seeing more and more of that now, where companies are by default using the information to make those kind of informed decisions.
Yeah, it's a really good example because the immediacy of it, I think that's that can be a challenge, can't it, sometimes, where there isn't necessarily the immediacy because there's a strategic approach, or by definition what people are doing is a strategic approach, and then they don't see the immediate sort of payback. Or sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to offer the slow moving rail crash example as well, which was where something was happening over a period of several months, and it was a different company. And this time they had a product that they thought was doing really well. When we looked at our sales, the sales were going off, fantastically. It looked really, really good. We looked beyond that, however, and we looked at the overall marketplace, and we realized that our market share was growing as well. So double whammy, salespeople were happy, sales were going up, marketing were happy because our growth in market share was going up. But when you actually tracked it over several months, what you noticed was that the market itself was declining, and the competitors had realized that this was a market that the demand for it was dropping away. So they were dropping out of the market, which is why we were growing our market share, and it's why our sales were increasing. So we were investing heavily in a product for which there was about to be no demand. So what it meant was, when you graph that out over several months, it was quite a slow trend at first, but it became obvious that we were investing in something that strategically was a bad idea. And that was a slow moving rail crash happening in real time.
Gary, you reminded me of Margin Call. Have you seen that film?
Yeah, I absolutely love that.
I know. I can't get enough of it. I'm fairly obsessed with it, but even though I don't understand all the details, but I think that's the point. I don't think nobody did at the time, but yeah, that's an amazing example of sort of loosely based, or I guess quite linked to reality of data decisions. But I think I'm just thinking about the things we're talking about, and again, it's by definition people need skills in these areas. Analytics, for example. What if someone was starting out in their career, we've covered quite a few things: analytics, distributed ledger. What do you think people should look for? What should they study? I mean, there's so much going on. I know, putting you on the spot here, but what are the things they should search for, the roles? Where is there a skills gap, I guess, is what I'm saying. If you were to employ people today, what skill sets would you be looking for?
Okay, so I think it's generally accepted that within about 10 years, most current jobs won't exist. But don't panic, because that means that the new jobs don't exist yet. They will come. Some of the stuff I did at the beginning of my career, they don't exist anymore. It's just the nature of it. So I always say to people, your job in yourself is to keep yourself appraised of what's going on and that kind of thing, and don't actually look too far ahead. Look at what's needed in the near term, because invariably what happens in the long term is never what you expect. So I say to people, look at what's happening at the moment. So there's a load of hype around artificial intelligence, ChatGPT, which is by the OpenAI Foundation, is causing waves. So go and read up about it, learn a little bit about it, think about how it could affect your current role, your future role, your direction, that kind of thing. YouTube is your friend. YouTube, I find, is a phenomenal resource, for learning new things. And what I always say to people as well is, go to where your passion takes you and do more of it. So if you like being analytical, do more analytical things. If you like operational things, do more operational things. Get better at what you're good at, as opposed to trying to get good at stuff that you're not good at. And if you're in an organization already, look at how you can use that to help you learn about things whilst helping that organization, because they'll be supportive of it. If you can come up with new ways of doing things that don't cost them too much money and don't expose them to risk, or gives them benefit, why would they not choose to work with you on that?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. I often think about the data, digital data and technology covering, and then I always talk about information management. And digital transformation, are they the same thing? No, of course they're not. But I think it covers so many things, doesn't it, nowadays, that it's. I feel, well, I don't mean that. I feel it must be quite sometimes impenetrable for people. That was one of the motivations for doing this podcast, right? Is some of the jargons and that jargon for people to get into it. Talking about do you talk about digital transformation? Is that the language that you would use with your clients? Just throwing one of the terms out there.
Not really, because the digital transformation for a lot of people meant create a website for my company. Initially, it meant go online, a number of years ago, and then digital transformation meant stop using paper processes. Let's actually capture it in a spreadsheet or a form or something. So digital transformation, people almost think of it as a binary thing of, well, you're not digitally transformed, now you are. It's actually a spectrum, and it's constantly evolving one, with the possible exception of the insurance industry, which until 2 years ago, which was still using paper-based systems. Everyone's pretty much digital now in some way. It's how they exploit that and how they utilize that, and how do they figure out how to improve customer service by reducing the amount of data that you ask people to fill in. Don't know about you, but if you ever fill a form in and you think, why do they need to know this? I've been an account holder with you for 20 years. Why do you need my address? Why do I have to type it in there? So digital transformation, I think, is an ongoing journey. It's a constant improvement type thing.
Yeah, and I think that sort of iterative approach is something that we'd be familiar with more in the IT side of it, but again, certainly with a sort of a BIM and building information modeling, we used to talk about level 1, level 2, level like maturity, and again, they've quite rightly said no, it's a continual improvement, or it should be, as you've said, as every sector should be. Have you got anything to say? And this is just for me, if you indulge me, about parametric insurance. That's very, very specific and just throwing it out there. But you're the man to ask. So first of all, what is it for people? For me, throwing that in there, and tell us about it.
Yeah. So parametric insurance is insurance based on a parameter. So that parameter might be something really, really simple. Think if you're on a flight, for example, and people have flight delay insurance. Well, your flight's either delayed or it isn't. It's binary, okay? And so what parametric insurance does is it looks at these events as what are called trigger events. So your flight was either delayed or it wasn't. So really simple example, if your flight's delayed, pay compensation. Not nice and easy. You can do that in an Excel spreadsheet, can't you? Of a nice simple Excel formula of if flight delayed, pay compensation. So parametric insurance builds on exactly that. And what you have, and this is where we're using technology jargon now, on a blockchain or distributed ledger system, you have what are called smart contracts, which are the worst named things ever. Smart contracts are neither smart nor contracts. They are computer code. They're a small computer program, and their purpose might be, for example, to monitor flight information. And so if you take out a policy, and I've worked with a couple of companies who are doing exactly this, to ensure against your flight being delayed, it monitors, it sees if your flight was delayed, and if it was, you get paid compensation. Lovely and simple. I did a presentation with a group of insurers a year or so ago, and I said to them, right, any of you ever had a flight where it was delayed, blah, 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 loads of them had. How many of you claim on insurance? Very few of them, which is very sad for the insurance industry. And I said, okay, of those of you who claimed, how long did your insurance claim take? And they said, oh, it was really, really fast. It was really good. It only took about 2 weeks. It's like, okay. With parametric insurance, you can do that in 2 seconds. And in fact, even better, you don't even have to make the claim, it just happens automatically. So that's an example. Apply that now as a company in Germany called EtherRisk, who I did some work with, of let's have parametric insurance on crop protection insurance. So imagine you're a farmer in Sri Lanka, and it's generally accepted if it rains more than, say, 80 centimeters in a month, you've had massive floods, your crop is wiped out. What you don't want to do is fill in a claim form, have an insurance assessor coming out, they haggle over the damage to the crop, it takes months and months, blah, blah, blah. What you want is, if it rains more than a certain amount, get paid compensation. So that's exactly what they've done with Aon, who are an insurance broker, and they have crop protection insurance, which is parametric. So you can then extend that to other things like solar arrays. If your solar panel doesn't generate a certain amount of electricity over a certain time, but you're contracted to deliver it, then take an insurance policy on it. Nice and simple again. So if you can apply simple math, simple logic, that's an example where you can use parametric insurance.
Great. Thanks, Gary. Certainly the smart contract is an immediate parallel with the digital twin and the BIM world as well. They're obviously that's where things are going, and in a similar and parallel and linked and converging, no doubt, vein as well. So certainly there's efficiencies there. As far as all the things that we've talked about, what's like the next thing coming, or I know we've mentioned it already, things like AI and that, but what really are the next sort of emergent technologies that maybe we haven't explored yet? Maybe you've already mentioned them, or maybe there's terminologies that you haven't mentioned yet, but what should we look for?
There are so many on the distant horizon that it's almost not worth looking at them. People talk about bioengineering, nanobot technology. Elon Musk will talk about integrating compute capability. He talks of the merger of silicon and carbon. In other words, having brain implants, this kind of thing. That's kind of so far ahead of the scale that I don't want to go there, because it's at least 2 years away, and that's a very long time in technology terms these days. The more immediate stuff is going to be things like quantum computing, which is beginning to happen now. Quantum computing exponentially increases the compute capability of what's going on, but again, it's at the kind of the hype phase at the moment. You can access quantum computing via Google and IBM, but it's relatively limited at the moment. More current is things like artificial intelligence. So everyone has heard of AI now. It's actually been around for over 50 years. Artificial intelligence, you can trace its origins back to mid-1950s. But it's taken that long before it becomes normal. So things like chatbots, conversational type things. People think of chatbots where you go onto a website and it says, "Hi, how can I help you today?" Well, actually think of those if they are true intelligence, and then think of them not just in chat, as in text, but audio, so they actually speak to you. And Microsoft have got some good examples, and Google as well, of actually having spoken chatbots where you don't actually realize you're speaking to a robot. So I think all of that's coming on quite quickly, because that removes the need for call centers to do call handling, that kind of thing, and running queries. Longer term, hopefully they'll actually use the AI to improve the products and services so they don't need the call centers in the first place. So AI definitely, blockchain, that kind of thing. Blockchain's an infrastructure technology, which means ultimately you shouldn't need to know you're using it. It doesn't matter. You don't think about, oh, am I using Microsoft SQL Server or Oracle DB or whatever? You just use it. And blockchain, with being an infrastructure protocol layer, you won't even notice it. So I think people will see AI more and more, and simply, go and use your favorite search engine, and it is getting integrated with Google. They're beginning to use Bard at the moment, which is an AI technology. Microsoft are introducing ChatGPT. They're introducing a thing called Microsoft Copilot, which is where your Office documents will be integrated with AI. So you might remember many years ago the Windows little paperclip helper of, "Hi, I see you're trying to write a Word document. Can I annoy you, please?" Well, this time around, it'll be of genuine help.
but it might not look as cute and jump around on the yeah, because the first thing was how could you disable it, right, when you opened Word? So but so thank you for listing all of them. I'll certainly put some links into, because again there might be, I'm sure there will be people not familiar even with things like ChatGPT, and so I'll link to them. I mean, I've been looking at these things myself and they're very good. There's other maybe not so amazing ones that I've used that you pay for, and but they're still good. They're still good.
Yep.
There is some, even though it's artificial, there is some form arguably of creativity, or it appears to be creative, let's put it that way, in writing copy. So it's quite scary. But I think all these things are coming together. When you were talking there, I was just thinking about we talked about blockchain and security. I think what do you see as one of the biggest hurdles to overcome as far as adoption of sort of the current technology? So I'll leave it quite vague and open on purpose, because you mentioned the people process technology. Often, as you already have articulated, it's often the people. What's one of the bigger or biggest challenges at the moment that we need to overcome with people to either adopt or upskill the current technologies and solutions? Is there any? Yeah,
it's painfully simple. It's usability. People I describe as like flowing water. They will take path of least resistance. If you want people to adopt a new system, make it easier for them to use that new system than the current method. So what we tend to do is a kind of a carrot and stick approach with a lot of technologies, and it tends to be more stick and no carrot. Whereas in actual fact, if you offer people a new system, they say, well, why should I use this new system? Well, it's quicker, faster, cheaper, and easier for you to use. It will take you less time, less effort, and it will give you better results. But they'll do it. You don't need to promote it and this kind of thing. That's where I say to people, if you need to do explainer videos to explain how something works, then it's not intuitive. You know, the number of companies I've worked with who said, oh yeah, we've developed this intuitive solution, and they've got like a 30-page user manual on how to use it. No, I didn't need training in how to use Google originally as a search engine. Anyone who tries out ChatGPT will discover very quickly you don't need training in how to use that. It is totally intuitive. Look at how children embrace technology and how they'll use certain things. They'll just go and use YouTube to find something. As far as I know, no one's been on a how do I learn how to use YouTube video, because it's intuitive. You do it, you search it, and that kind of thing. So usability is absolutely the critical thing. Make it easier for people and they'll use it anyway.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think for some, maybe not for us, but for some people, that's forgotten about. do you know what I mean? It's like almost the last thing. Absolutely, I mean, bizarre, because that's clearly one of the first things that should be thought about. What I was going to mention, I couldn't recall when I asked the last question, was about people often ask me, are people using AI? And I mean, well, that's like when you on Netflix, when it's recommending, or on Amazon, in the background somewhere. Correct me if I'm wrong, Gary. You'll be the man to.
Absolutely.
Right. That is it, right?
Well, I mentioned chatbots, and when you talk about those, you think as them as separate things like call center things. But if you're using voice recognition, Siri, Alexa, any of these things, they're all AI based. If you're doing something like you're using a mapping tool in the public domain, not the specialist ones, Google Maps or Bing Maps, they're using AI as well. You look at a recommendation engine. If you go onto Amazon, people who bought this also bought this. That's using AI on that. So we're already using a lot of AI, and companies are embedding the capabilities so that you're using it without realizing it. So my mobile phone, when I take a photo, it has got AI capabilities built into it to enhance the picture, to stabilize it, to change the color balance, all without me even realizing it.
Yeah, and I think they do quite scarily. They all do facial recognition to group the photos as well. I think that's in the phone as well, apparently. I mean, that's absolutely interesting. That it's actually that capabilities within the phone itself, which is remarkable if you think about it. But
my phone's got an ability. It has, as you call, a face tracker, so that if I move around, it will automatically track me. So it knows what a face looks like. And I didn't tell it. I didn't, describe exactly me and all this kind of thing. It uses AI for that. And then you extend that. There are trials going on in some parts of the country at the moment around facial payments technology. So rather than paying cash or using a debit card or using touch to pay, you just look at the screen and it automatically does an identity check, works out who you are, goes to your bank balance, makes sure you got the money, makes an automatic payment. And this is where I have a bit of a problem at times, that I'm torn, because on a technology basis, that's phenomenal. It's absolutely incredible. On a societal basis, that's quite scary Black Mirror material of, hang on, that, a computer is now deciding that I can buy a tin of beans in a supermarket. From an automation point of view, brilliant. From a societal point of view, it's got some challenges.
Yeah, but biometrics, I mean, we just maybe move, because I'm quite interested in that one, but maybe we'll park that for another day, the biometric thing. But there was one terminology that I thought, again, I try not to go too tech, but we're going all in tech today. Why not? Is big data, right? Because is that term still used? What is it? Do you talk about big data? Again, yeah. Apologies for lobbing these in here, but it's just these terminologies that come up and people think. So big data, do we still talk about that, and what is it?
Absolutely. So the original definition of big data, which was about 15 or so years ago now, was any data that was too large to process and analyze using conventional computing technology. So basically lots of it. Okay. So the original computers I worked on in the 1980s literally filled a building. We used Teradata systems and Honeywell things, and these were big mainframes that literally filled up an entire building. And on one of the computers, we had the entire UK electoral roll, which at the time I think was 46 million people. I can fit that on my mobile phone now. So the concept of big data meaning an awful lot of data has kind of gone away. So we went on to initially what we call the 3 V's of big data, which were volume, variety, and volatility, I think it was. So volume, how much of it, volatility, how fast it's coming through, and variety, how different it is. We've now taken that further, and I talk about the 8 V's of big data, which include veracity, variability, velocity. There's all sorts of other things in the marketing speak. So yes, we do still talk about big data, but if you think about Excel, as an example, Excel, I can't even remember how many rows and columns there are in the latest version of Excel, but it means you can handle up to 16 billion data points, if I remember correctly. So that's pretty big. So as I say, the old definition of big data just means lots of data has kind of gone away. But we look at things like there are companies who are doing analytics around shipping movements. So where every container is going around the world and this kind of thing. Billions of transactions a day, and it means they can look at that to work out what the world economy is doing and this kind of thing. That's a huge volume of data where you're tracking ships, containers, products, vessels, ports, and all this kind of thing. And actually do that to see where the business activity is going on. That's an example of big data. So we do still use the term big data, but it's become very broad. Now, I actually talk about the importance of small data, because it's the small data that can mess you up at times. And I use examples of where companies have actually gone bust because of very small data. So don't just think of the big data.
What I guess you have to be careful how much you say, but what is an example of what do you mean by that? Like a missing spreadsheet or emails, or what formats?
Even smaller. I know of a company who went bankrupt because of a single letter, and that letter was the letter S. And what it was, and it's in the public domain as well, so I can talk about it.
Okay. Yeah.
And it was a mistake that was made, I think it was about 10 or maybe more years ago now, by Companies House. So Companies House maintain the register of all companies in the UK. And there was a company, the exact name of which I can't remember now, but they did actually file for closure, that they went bankrupt. And it's something like, Johnson and Sons, okay? So plural, and this company went bust. And so Companies House made the amendments on the database record to say that Johnson and Company had gone bust. So they missed out the letter S. There were two companies, almost identical names. That company that had actually been in business for over 100 years, was perfectly liquid, perfectly solvent, suddenly wasn't, because its suppliers did credit checks and noticed that they'd gone bust, even though they hadn't. And so when suppliers stop supplying you, you do go bust. So this company that actually had a court action against Companies House, where they went into solvency simply because of a single character, means that the wrong company had been set up to be bankrupt, and actually sent them out of business. And I think it was significant compensation they got for that. That's a really simple example. A non-terrestrial example would be the Mars Explorer with NASA, where they got a really simple calculation wrong. I think they used metric instead of imperial. So at the point at which the Mars Explorer, this satellite type thing about to descend onto Mars, was about to blast the rockets to slow its descent down, and they used the wrong unit of measure, and it means that they got the parameters propulsion wrong, and so it disappeared without trace, and that was millions and millions of dollars worth of stuff that just went. So yeah, several examples of that kind of thing, of units of measure being wrong, single letters being wrong.
It's about checks and balances, isn't it, or lack of it, and it comes back to that people and we know we've talked about that for a long time in the IT sector, but people, process, technology, but it does come back to that people and process. Yep. You know, that could have been caught, obviously, if people were better trained or whatever in the scenario, but also if there was a robust process to pick up, you know, some kind of tolerance for the, or maybe with the second example, but certainly with the first. I mean, I wouldn't be amazed now, but early in my career, I was amazed at different units of measure in different sectors, yeah, and the different ways of writing the date.
the date, I just love. There is actually an ISO date format, which is great because it makes a lot of problems go away. But you're right, things like dates, measurements. This is why I'm always cautious when I work on multinational projects, where you always have to up front agree what units of measure you're going to use. Are you going to use imperial? Are you going to use metric, and so on? You know, and another example of that is in Canada a few years ago. There was an aeroplane that nearly crashed, an Air Canada Boeing 767, I think it was, simply because when they put the fuel on board, they'd request so many tons of fuel. Problem with tons is that there's an imperial ton and there's a metric ton. And the pilot, I think, thought he'd ordered in metric, and the fuel had put it in an imperial. And the first they knew about it was when they were at 36,000 feet or whatever, and both engines stopped. And the pilot and co-pilot looked at the dials and like, we're on fumes here type thing, and they literally ran out of fuel and turned into what was called a Gimli glider, where this Boeing 767 was probably the biggest glider in the world for a while. So that could have resulted in literally hundreds of deaths from a simple mistake. The one thing that saved them was that one of the pilots was a glider pilot. He said, "Oh, okay, I'm just in a big glider now," and he landed it safely at a disused airfield.
I mean, it is interesting, that specific example of ton, the fact that the word that someone thought, let's add another N and an E, and we'll just
Yep.
No one will worry about that one. I did look up the standard because coincidentally I was doing some training yesterday, and we did actually mention the international standard for date. It's ISO 8601. Of course, most people wouldn't be able to quote it, but myself included. But there's a standard, or a schema, should I say, that just out of interest that the central UK government is promoting for the built environment sector, called COBE. Anyway, it's a schema, and within that, you know, 8601 is the preferred data structure, as you would hope. Yeah.
No. Actually, I'd hope they go for 8601-2, which is a slight variation, which includes the Nordic region, if I remember correctly. Right. So this shows just how sad you can be when you can talk ISO standards at that level.
Well, but I'm throwing it in there on purpose, just to, you know, not show off that we know them, but just to say they are out there, you know, because people talk, again, if people haven't, if you like, get their hands dirty with data, where I've sort of witnessed where different organizations I've worked with have forgotten to specify you know, and then we just get dates in various formats. Or certainly early in my career, I've had to cleanse data. Have you got anything? I know we're talking about it now, but again, maybe just an open question. Have you got anything to say just about data quality? I know we've probably touched on it multiple times, just about what some of the common big challenges are and what, you know, what's been done to improve data quality. I know that's fairly nebulous, but yeah.
The starting point really goes above data, and it comes up to more in terms of business level type stuff. So if you're going to come up with a data quality definition of a piece of data, first of all, define what the data actually is. You know, what do you mean by it? So we're talking about, you know, tons, for example, you know, metric and imperial. This is why your starting point in any data quality initiative needs to be a business glossary, where you have a clear definition of what the business terms are. You know, there's another industry I know, that the healthcare industry, which uses the word section. Now, section in the context of gynecology and, you know, childbirth, and that means, you know, that performing a section, a C-section, that kind of thing. In the mental health side of things, it means being sectioned, where you get locked up and everything. I know an example of a mental health nurse who actually had that word used upon her at one point, and she thought it meant she was going to be sectioned when she was pregnant, and nearly ran out of the building. So that's an example of, you know, one word having two very different meanings within a building, because they both worked in the same hospital within the same industry. So think now about the risk of us using the same words across different industries. You know, and I did something with someone a while ago. It was really funny in the project management space, where he was talking about how he was running this pilot project. I said, oh, it's really interesting. What sort of pilots are they? He said, no, I mean a pilot project as in, you know, a beginnings thing. Oh, I thought you meant aviation. So it shows how we use these words. So data quality, it comes down to, first of all, making sure we're using the right words in the right way for the right meanings. And then understanding as well that data quality isn't a fixed point in time. I use what's called a SIPOC model, which is the supplier, input, process, output, customer model. At each of those levels, there may be different data definitions of quality requirements. So on a building site, you know, something people may be aware of on the BIM side of things, the quality of what gets put into a brick or a foundation might depend upon the nature of that brick and how it's going to be used. And so you don't want to use a low quality brick, which is fit for purpose when it's produced, but isn't fit for the purpose it's being used for. So this is ties in quite nicely with data quality then, of making sure that the data through its journey is fit for purpose. I have seen some improvements on that. What I tend to find is that a lot of people think of data quality as being a project that you do and it's happened and it's all there. Whereas again, it's an evolving, constantly monitoring, constantly improving situation.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. I think we're almost up to time, but I think of I think of these concepts quite a lot in my day job, because the challenge we've got, I think, a lot with others is they will always talk about semantics and taxonomies, and I think we know what they are, but they don't. They don't mean anything. We managed to, other than me saying them just now, ontologies, for example, we've managed to get away with explaining it without using them. So I just thought I'd throw them in there, where people come in with that jargon, and then the irony is people don't know. Yep. This is where it gets meta, because people don't know what they're talking about. The irony is they're trying to make things meaningful. So.
And you just did it by saying meta as well. So the thing about jargon, exactly. Jargon achieves two things. It actually makes simpler conversation within a profession. So if you're in the medical profession, they talk jargon because it's shorthand notation for them. So actually jargon can be good within an industry. It's when you step outside of it that it has the second useful function, which is to be protective of that industry. So I sometimes say that jargon is used within the industry to help each other communicate and to prevent others from getting into that industry.
Yeah, I completely echo that. Certainly with a original civil service background, it maybe wasn't intentional, but working in the government and in IT, I've seen lots of jargon, and now in engineering, and I mean, I'm sure you see it as well. And I think like you gave the example of a dictionary or a catalogue. I think that's conceptually people can understand that, but it's flabbergasting how we don't see it often.
Yep.
Like in the example you gave, I mean, that's a real sort of quick win, if you like. Let's just sit down and describe what we do as businesses and try to work out the terminologies. I've literally had most of my time with you, but you thankfully have already mentioned where concepts maybe people can look up. But just to ask you directly, are there any specific websites, and you may have mentioned them already, so just for the summary for me to add the links, that you recommend people to go to, particularly about the things you were talking about with insurance, and well, whatever you want to say, maybe just a handful. I know there's probably hundreds, but just a few that you'd recommend.
It's interesting because it's the one question I always struggle with, even though I often get asked it, about where do you go to for all this kind of thing, because it's such a wide range. You were mentioning earlier, you know, the wide range of things that are happening, and it's the same with learning about things happening. It's a bit like a data fog type thing. So I don't really recommend anything beyond just going onto a search engine and randomly typing stuff in at times, which sounds incredibly unstructured, and occasionally you will end up going down a complete rabbit hole of discovery. But just do something like, you know, we mentioned Gartner hype cycle earlier on. There is public information around Gartner, who are an analysis company who do research into what the big and emerging topics are. Go and find out what they're writing. They write some great papers about emerging technologies and that. Go and take a look at some of that.
Thanks, Gary. And the last question, again, you might say look again, which is absolutely fine. But are there any specific like physical events? I know most events are online now, but if people want to get out, are there any physical events you recommend or that you've been to recently? Maybe they'll have to wait for next year.
I've completely transitioned away from the physical world. You know, I now live in the metaverse, which is kind of fascinating. So I actually find that there's a massive amount of online events going on, which are a blend of real world and, you know, physical type thing. So if you take a look at what the likes of NVIDIA, for example, NVIDIA are a chipset manufacturer and do a lot of the video imaging type stuff, that they just held a 4-day conference, which was partly physical, partly virtual, talking about the metaverse and AI and all the stuff they're doing. Absolutely mind-blowing what they're getting into. I attended virtually last week an event that was in Dubai, which was about artificial intelligence and that kind of thing. So to be honest, I've kind of moved away from the real world, and I'm living in the metaverse.
That's good. Well, maybe that's where it is for some people. I have to sort of make good reasons to go to things nowadays, let's put it that way. So yeah, I'm completely with you, but I've had my time with you. I could literally talk all day, but thank you so much for your time and your insights, and anything we have mentioned and I can refer to, I will, and put links in the bottom. But I'd just like to thank you, Gary, for your time.
A pleasure. And if anyone wants to reach out, just Google or use whatever search engine, just Google Gary Nuttall emerging technology. I think I appear as the first 20 results in a particular space.
Thank you very much, Gary Nuttall from Distalytics. And who knows, we might do this again one day, but I found it very insightful. So thank you, Gary.
A pleasure.
Great. Thank you.